It is exactly 8:41 a.m. News and views right here on Salam Media. And our next guest is Professor Raymond Durrheim. He's a South Africa Research Chair in Exploration, Earthquake and Mining Seismology to talk about that horrible experience most of us encountered on Sunday morning. I started saying my prayers, Professor, when I was when I was awakened by these tremors. It was so scary, and the first thing that came to mind for me was the victims of the Turkish earthquake. And I just, after the tremor passed, I thought to myself, can you imagine those families, the horror that they experience, hearing their children screaming, not knowing what's going on, and then just, the experience of buildings and houses and everything collapsing around them and not saving their loved ones. And that's the horror that engulfed me Sunday morning, shortly after 2 o'clock here in Johannesburg, when we as Gauteng residents were jolted by the strongest quake in years in our part of the world. A very good morning to you, Professor. Welcome. And I'm sure you're going to respond to my very lengthy statement this morning.
Yes, thank you. It's good to be with you. And yeah, one can only, I suppose, one's heart goes out to the people in that tragedy in Turkey. For here, the shaking lasted only for a few seconds, even though it might have seemed a great deal longer. And most of our homes only, sustained a few cracks. But for the Turkish earthquake, that shaking would have lasted for more than a minute. And of course, with the persistent shaking, the houses would have collapsed. And if you're in an apartment building that just collapses like a pancake, it's catastrophic. And so it is truly alarming. I think we can say here in Johannesburg and in the Gauteng region, these earthquakes, they are unusual. But 30 or 40 years ago, when I first moved up here in the late 1970s, they were a regular event. We'd have a felt earthquake every week because in those days, there was active mining just south of Johannesburg, south of the M2, in the Boksburg region, the ERPM, East Rand Proprietary Mine. At that stage was a very big and active mine. And was the deepest mine in the world, mining at depths of greater than 3 kilometers below surface. And so mining-related tremors were frequently experienced. I think part of the issue now is that people in our region just aren't used to this, so this is really alarming. But if you live in Carletonville or Klerksdorp or Welkom, where there's still active deep mining, events like this are felt fairly regularly.
I remember those earthquakes, or rather the tremors, back in the day as I was growing up, because I was born and raised in Johannesburg. So I'm very, very well aware of those as well. And the fact that we are or were a mining town, mining city. Was this tremor directly related to the fact that we still have all these deep gorges underground, and there is this ongoing mining activities by the Zamazamas, or is that a different issue altogether?
Well, the Council for Geoscience, who run the national network, they're busy today analyzing the data in detail. And so in the next day or two, we'll learn a bit more about with, I suppose, certainty about the cause. But certainly the preliminary information is that it's related to the decades or even the century of mining that's taken place around the East Rand. If you look at all the mine dumps that you see on the surface, you can imagine all that I suppose what is now the ground up rock would have come from deep underground. And so at one time, there were very extensive excavations. Each excavation is not very high. It's perhaps 1 or 2 meters high. So they weren't very tall excavations, but with huge lateral extent. And the earth is still trying to close those voids. And gradually, as the rock creaks and cracks, we have seismicity happening below what we can feel all the time. But every now and again, there's an earthquake that's big enough that we feel it. The Zamazamas, generally, they are working at shallow depths. They're not working deep down. And in fact, these deep mines have been allowed to flood. The water's been allowed to return to close to its normal level. And so in these areas like the East Rand, Zamazamas aren't deep down. near the surface. So their activities, while they are very risky, because often they are chipping away at old pillars, they're not putting in the support, they don't have all the safety systems, and that can certainly lead to perhaps subsidence on the near surface if they undermine perhaps a road or a railway line. And it can lead to it's a hugely risky undertaking for the mine workers, the zama-zamas. But the zama-zama activities aren't likely at all to cause a tremor, lead to a tremor.
So let's look at our situation here in Johannesburg, and it seems as if Boksburg, the town of Boksburg, was seemed to have felt the tremor more acutely than the rest of us. We kind of almost got the ripple effect of it. We've agreed that mining probably does play a part, but when we look at the whole issue around seismology, has anything happened beyond our borders, maybe deep down in the seas or in other countries, that has precipitated this event in Johannesburg or Boksburg?
Yeah, there's no real credible way in which we can relate this, let's say, to a Turkish earthquake or any other large earthquake. This seems to be very much related to the local activity. Of course, globally, there's earthquakes happening down the East African Rift, and that puts stresses in the Earth's crust. Our crust is continually being eroded, and so the continent is rising very slowly as let's say the mountains are eroded, and so these induce stresses and strains in the crust, and these can lead to natural earthquakes which occur from time to time, and they can occur almost anywhere in southern Africa. The biggest natural earthquake that we've felt happened in 1969 near the towns of Ceres and Tulbagh in the Western Cape, and of course something like that could happen again. There have been largish earthquakes in Botswana, and that is related to the rifting of the continent. There have also been large earthquakes bigger than magnitude 6 in KwaZulu-Natal, and also in Koffiefontein in the Free State. And so these earthquakes do happen from time to time, perhaps every decade or two on average around South Africa.
Let's look at the issue around, and this is the big question and the all important question, I guess, climate change and the environment, because the environmentalists are going to put this directly down to the issue around climate change.
Yeah, the climate change, of course, is a big issue with regard to extreme events, cyclones, floods, even thunderstorms. But there's no real way in which you can relate what's happening in the atmosphere to what's happening in the Earth's crust. So I do not see any connection between an earthquake like this and climate change. But I do believe that we need to take climate change seriously. It can have other effects on our life, on the way we live, on not only the distribution of diseases, on our crops, and these are things that we need to be taken seriously as well.
Okay, we've also been hearing people talk about aftershocks or tremors that are still to come post the tremor we felt on Sunday morning. Is that a possibility? And if so, what sort of measures do we need to put in place just to protect ourselves? Please, God, it's nothing major, but should it happen, what ought we be doing?
Yeah, there's a very high likelihood that there will be aftershocks. The general rule is, and this is just from statistical studies, is that your biggest aftershock is about 1 magnitude unit smaller than the main shock. So here we had a magnitude, let's say 4.5. So you could get an aftershock of up to maybe 3.5. And that would certainly be felt quite strongly in that area, but it shouldn't lead to any damage. Of course, it will lead to perhaps people being alarmed. But one can never exclude the possibility that there might be an even bigger event. That's, I'd say, highly unlikely, but it could happen. What to do when you feel an earthquake? Well, the general advice is, and let's say in countries which are really earthquake prone, like Japan and California, just like we should have fire drills in our schools, they have earthquake drills. And what they learn to do is, if you feel an earthquake, don't try to run outside. You're more likely to be trampled in a stampede or fall down the stairs or be struck by falling masonry or shattering glass. What you need to do is first drop to the ground and then seek cover under your school desk or under a table or perhaps in a doorway, and then hold onto the leg of the table, because of course the shaking could cause this to move, and to protect you perhaps from objects falling from the ceiling or the collapse of a roof, and wait it out for those few tens of seconds that will take. And then, of course, you cautiously get out and look and see if there's anybody who needs help. So do not try to run outside a tall building. If it's easy for you to step outside, you're on the ground floor and the door's next to you, then you can leave. But otherwise, stay where you are, seek cover. Drop, cover, hold are the 3 words.
Seismology sounds like a very, very interesting area of study. I'm so glad I've had you on the show this morning, because it's something we don't ever think about. And of course, this event has happened on Sunday morning, so now we're all wanting to know so much more about it. You also mentioned about earthquake-prone regions and countries. You mentioned California, you mentioned Japan. What is the reason for that?
Well, the reason for that is that when one looks at the way in which the Earth works in a major way, you find that earthquakes don't happen, they're not equally spread all around the world. They occur in very definite zones. And about 50 years ago, a whole theory to explain this was developed called the theory of plate tectonics, which explains that the Earth is losing its heat. The center of the Earth is really hot, about 5,000 degrees Celsius. And that causes convection currents in the Earth's mantle. And this drives the motion of the continents in the same way we see that Africa and South America once were one supercontinent. Over the last 200 million years, they've drifted apart, and ocean ridges developed in the center of the ocean. And as oceans move apart, continents move apart, in other places they crash together. So it is the slow motion of continents and then crashing into each other that leads to earthquakes. So just in the same way we see weather systems moving, we see cold fronts moving through, we see high pressure and low pressure systems, we have similar processes happening in the Earth's mantle. They're just a lot slower, but every now and again they can lead to the sudden release of energy that's stored up in the Earth's crust, and that leads to these great events. For example, the one that happened in Turkey earlier this year.
Fascinating indeed. I'm going to wrap up by asking this final question. We've been hearing once again by the climate change fundis that, and we've seen footage of it as well, the icebergs beginning to melt and crumble and break off in the Arctic. How is that impacting on what we're talking about now, earthquakes and, seismic shifts, etc., on the Earth or the Earth's crust, etc.? And that, of course, if that does eventually happen in 50, 100, 200 years' time, the whole land surface area of the Earth is going to change absolutely and dramatically, isn't it?
Well, it certainly will have an effect. And the thing is that so much of the world's population lives close to sea level in the coastal cities. So even a sea level rise of half a meter or a meter will lead to, there'll be storm surges, will lead to areas being flooded, and will mean that millions of people will need to be resettled. And so that will be a big effect. You find, let's say, when you're talking about the ice sheets melting, well, 15,000 years ago, we had an ice age where the ice cap over the North Pole extended down into England, into Great Britain, into Germany. And we can still see today the result of that melting of that ice cap in countries like Sweden. You find in that the continent is still slowly rising as a response to this taking off the load. And so you find earthquakes that are happening in areas that were previously covered by ice caps due to the unloading of the ice. And so this will happen. But certainly the concern is not so much about earthquakes that might be triggered, but by major flooding in low-lying areas. And in geological time, when you think about tens or hundreds of millions of years ago, we've seen a lot bigger sea level changes than we're happening now. But then, of course, humankind just lived in small bands, could easily move inland to a new situation. But we've got big infrastructure, a vast population, and so the impact's going to be significant.
Ooh. Fascinating indeed. I could sit here talking to you for hours on end. So very interesting. But thank you, Professor Raymond Durrheim, South Africa Research Chair in Exploration, Earthquake and Mining Seismology. God bless. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Julie.
It is exactly 8:56 a.m. News and views on Salam Media, and standing by to talk to us is a councillor for Ward 27, and that's you, Ernest Smith. We're going to be talking about Morningside in KZN, so please do become a part of the conversation.